The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Published in 1820, a Lantern Library retelling. There is a quiet valley not far from the Hudson River, known for generations as Sleepy Hollow. To wander into it is to feel as though the world has slowed, as though the place is wrapped in a dream. The hills rise gently around it, the streams wind lazily through meadows, and even the air itself seems heavy with enchantment. Strangers who pass through notice it at once. They find themselves growing drowsy without cause, lulled into an unnatural calm. The longer one remains, the more the feeling deepens. Time drifts differently here, as though the valley holds its visitors in a trance. The people who live in Sleepy Hollow reflect this same peculiarity. They move with an easy slowness, speak softly, and carry an air of quiet thoughtfulness. It is as if the enchantment of the land seeps into their very souls. But this dreamlike stillness is touched by something darker. For the people of Sleepy Hollow are steeped in superstition more than any community in the region. They are devoted collectors of ghost stories. Tales of strange sights and sounds are not just told by the fireside for amusement. They are believed with an almost unshakable certainty. The most famous of all their legends is that of the Headless Horseman. According to the story, during the days of the Revolutionary War, a Hessian soldier was struck by a cannonball and lost his head in battle. His body was buried in the graveyard by the old Dutch church, but his spirit could not rest. On dark nights he rises from the grave, mounts his powerful black steed, and rides across the hollow in search of his missing head. Some say he carries the severed head before him, cradled in the crook of his arm. Others claim it is strapped to the saddle. All agree that he is a terrifying figure, a rider without a face, cloaked in black, horse-snorting fire as it gallops furiously along the lonely roads. At the church bridge he disappears suddenly, swallowed into the night, returning to his grave until the next ride. Stories of the horseman are told and retold, always with the same hushed awe. Farmers returning home late swear they have been pursued by a rider who vanished at the bridge. Children whisper of seeing a figure moving through the trees at dusk, silent and swift. More than one villager claims to have heard the pounding of unseen hooves behind them, chasing them down the road. Mothers caution their children never to wander alone after dark, warning that the horseman still searches, forever searching. It is said his spirit is restless because he cannot cross into the next world without his head. Some insist he roams the battlefield where he was slain, hunting for it. Others fear he seeks to claim a new head from the living to replace the one he lost. Whatever the cause, the legend clings to the hollow like the morning mist, shaping the lives and fears of those who dwell there. And it is not only the horseman. The valley abounds with ghostly lore. Travelers tell of lights flickering deep in the swamp, of voices calling from the trees, of strange shapes glimpsed at crossroads. The old Dutch wives are masters of these tales, spinning stories so chilling that grown men feel their skin crawl. And yet the people never tire of them. The supernatural has become part of the hollow's very character, inseparable from its fields and streams. So it is a place at once beautiful and haunted, peaceful by day, eerie by night, always steeped in a dreamy atmosphere that blurs the line between waking and sleep. Into this curious corner of the world, one autumn long ago, came a newcomer who would be swept into its mysteries. His name was Ichabod Crane, and he came to Sleepy Hollow to serve as the schoolmaster. His arrival and the events that followed would entwine his fate with the legend itself. The new schoolmaster who came to Sleepy Hollow was unlike anyone the valley had ever seen. He was tall and exceedingly lanky, with narrow shoulders and arms that dangled awkwardly from his sides. His legs were long and spindly, his feet enormous, and his hands seemed to have no end. His small head perched on his thin neck like a bird balanced on a reed. From it projected a long nose, sharp and beak-like, while his ears stood out wide as if listening for every stray sound. To see him striding along the road, with his clothes flapping and his elbows poking, was to imagine some giant scarecrow suddenly come to life. Yet for all his comical form, Ichabod held himself with a sense of great dignity. He fancied that he cut an impressive figure, especially when he wore his only fine suit on Sundays. His walk was lofty, his chin raised, and his long limbs swung with exaggerated grace, as though he were some man of society rather than a humble school teacher earning meager wages. Ichabod's school stood in a low building set a little back from the road. There, each morning, the children of the valley gathered under his sharp eye. He ruled with a strict hand, but he was never cruel. He knew how to temper his scoldings with gentleness, and he took pride in keeping the affection of both parents and pupils. He had learned that for every cuff or stern word given to a boy, it was wise to show kindness to the boy's mother, who would see to it that her son held no lasting grudge. In this way, Ichabod was always welcome in the households of the Hollow, where he was often invited to supper and treated as an honored guest. And he loved nothing more than to be fed, for Ichabod Crane, though lean of body, was blessed, or cursed, with an appetite of remarkable size. His eyes shone at the sight of food. His imagination lingered on pies and roasts as fondly as on poetry. When he visited a farmhouse, he never failed to take careful note of every ham hanging in the smokehouse, every shelf lined with pickles and preserves, every cellar stocked with cider. Even as he walked through the countryside, his gaze wandered constantly. Here an orchard heavy with apples, there a field ripe with pumpkins, yonder a meadow where fat turkeys strutted. To Ichabod, the entire valley was one great feast laid out before him, but if food was one passion, superstition was another. Ichabod delighted in ghost stories, and in Sleepy Hollow he found a treasure trove of them. He could sit for hours by the fire, listening to the old Dutch wives spin tales of haunted glens, bewitched brooks, and spectral riders. His eyes would widen, his mouth would hang open, and he would beg for more, no matter how late the hour grew. Yet when he left for home, the courage he pretended to possess often melted away. The still woods pressed close about him, the moon cast long shadows, and every rustle of a leaf made him start. He would quicken his pace, humming a hymn to steady himself, or suddenly break into a run, convinced that something terrible was following at his heels. Despite this weakness, Ichabod considered himself a man of taste and refinement. He taught not only reading and arithmetic, but also singing, and he prided himself on his ability to lead the choir. This earned him extra income and, more importantly, extra opportunities to mingle with the young women of the valley. Ichabod was not blind to their charms, and though he was awkward in form, he carried himself with the self-assurance of a gallant. He was quick with compliments, eager to flatter, and bold in offering his services. His pride extended beyond the classroom and choir loft. Ichabod imagined himself something of a connoisseur of fine things, even if his own belongings were threadbare. He strutted as though his patched coat were a gentleman's frock, and he spoke of books and poetry with the air of a scholar. His mind, however, often drifted from noble subjects to far more practical ones, the wealth of others, and how he might one day share in it. For Ichabod, Crane was ambitious. He longed to escape the poverty of a wandering schoolmaster, to secure a life of comfort and plenty. He dreamed of broad farms, rich harvests, and groaning tables that would never be empty. He thought often of how pleasant it would be to marry well, to rise above his low station and live in ease. It was this dream that fixed his attention on one young woman in particular, the only daughter of Baltus Van Tassel, the wealthiest farmer in the Hollow. Her name was Katrina. She was admired by many for her beauty, but it was her inheritance that most dazzled Ichabod's imagination. Already he pictured himself presiding over her father's estate, lording over fields of grain, and eating daily from a table laden with delicacies. In his mind's eye, he saw himself transformed from a lanky, hungry schoolmaster into a man of consequence. Thus, when Ichabod first arrived in Sleepy Hollow, He was greeted with curiosity and mild amusement, yet he carried within him ambitions that stretched far beyond the small walls of his schoolhouse. He moved between the homes of the villagers, charming the mothers, flattering the daughters, and filling his belly at every opportunity. He listened eagerly to ghost stories, shivered at every shadow, strutted proudly in his patched clothes, and all the while dreamed of fortune. This mixture of vanity, greed, superstition, and charm made him at once comical and strangely compelling. The people of the Hollow laughed at him, yet welcomed him. They mocked his awkward figure, yet trusted him with their children. And so Ichabod Crane settled into Sleepy Hollow, little knowing that the valley, with all its legends and shadows, would soon lead him into the strangest and most terrifying adventure of his life. Baltus Van Tassel was one of the most prosperous farmers in Sleepy Hollow. His home stood broad and comfortable, surrounded by fertile fields and thriving orchards. The barns overflowed with grain, the pastures held plump cattle, and the cellars brimmed with cider. Baltus himself was a cheerful, round-faced man, content to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, a pipe after supper, a hearty laugh with neighbors, and the knowledge that his estate would one day belong to his only child. That only child was Katrina Van Tassel. At 18, she was the very image of Dutch beauty. Rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed, with a lively smile that hinted at mischief. She was admired by all the young men of the countryside, for she combined her father's wealth with her own charm. Katrina dressed smartly, favoring ribbons and embroidered gowns that showed both taste and prosperity. She carried herself with confidence, enjoying the attention she received, and though she was known as something of a flirt, her manner was never cruel. She simply delighted in being admired. To Ichabod Crane, Katrina was the pinnacle of his dreams. Her beauty captivated him, but what truly ensnared his heart was the fortune she would inherit. His imagination, always fertile, painted vivid scenes, himself seated at the head of Baltus Van Tassel's table, presiding over feasts of roasted fowl and steaming pies, himself riding across fertile fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, himself transformed from a wandering, underpaid schoolmaster into a man of consequence and comfort. Every time he visited the Van Tassel farm, he looked with greedy eyes at the abundance around him. The golden corn, the grazing sheep, the well-stocked larder, and thought, one day all this could be mine. Ichabod wasted no time in beginning his courtship. He presented himself at the Van Tassel home with exaggerated politeness, bowing low and speaking with gallantry. He offered Katrina singing lessons, complimented her gowns, and strutted about with all the elegance he could muster. Whenever she smiled or laughed at his words, Ichabod felt a surge of triumph, believing his cause advanced. He imagined himself already favored, already half accepted as her suitor. But Ichabod was not alone in his pursuit. Katrina had many admirers, for her beauty and her fortune drew young men from miles around. Among them, one stood above the rest, Brom Van Brunt, better known as Brom Bones. Brom was the very opposite of Ichabod. He was broad-shouldered and muscular, with a ruddy face and a boisterous laugh. He rode a powerful horse named Daredevil and was famed throughout the valley for his feats of strength and daring. Brom was the champion of every race, the victor of every wrestling match, the leader of every village prank. He was rough at times, fond of mischief and quick to a quarrel, but his good humor made him widely liked. Few dared oppose him, and fewer still succeeded. Brom had long set his heart on Katrina. He rode boldly to the Van Tassel farm, sat confidently at her side, and treated her as though she were already his. The other suitors, recognizing his strength and dominance, soon gave up the contest. But Ichabod Crane was not so easily frightened away. Though timid in many things, Ichabod possessed a stubborn determination when his ambitions were at stake. He knew he could not face Brom directly in strength or skill, so he employed stealth and cunning. He visited Katrina when he thought Brom was away, whispered compliments in her ear, and offered his gallant services whenever possible. He played the patient strategist, slipping in quietly where Brom blustered loudly. Brom noticed. His temper, though generally good, was not infinite. He tried to intimidate Ichabod, thundering past him on daredevil with mocking laughter, or stationing himself at Katrina's side when Ichabod arrived. But the schoolmaster persisted, always smiling, always deferential, always slipping back whenever Brom's back was turned. Frustrated, Brom turned to tricks. He and his gang of rowdy friends broke into Ichabod's schoolhouse at night, turning everything upside down. They stopped up his chimney so the room filled with smoke. They chased him with dogs when he walked home from choir practice. Each prank was designed to humiliate, to drive him from the field. Yet Ichabod endured them all, clinging tightly to his hopes. Every smile from Katrina, every polite word, was fuel for his ambition. As for Katrina herself, she seemed to enjoy the rivalry. She welcomed Ichabod's attentions with playful amusement, just as she basked in Brom's bold displays. Perhaps she encouraged them both. Perhaps she merely enjoyed being courted. Whatever her motives, she gave no clear preference, and so the contest continued, growing ever more heated. It was a strange battle indeed. On one side, Brom Bones, with his strength, his confidence, and his fearless horse. On the other, Ichabod Crane, tall and awkward, armed only with his wit, his manners, and his dreams of fortune. The people of Sleepy Hollow looked on with interest, gossiping by their firesides about which man would win the prize. The rivalry reached its height one autumn when Baltus Van Tassel announced a great harvest party at his farm. All the valley was invited, and the event promised to be the grandest of the season. There would be feasting and dancing, music and merriment, and an opportunity for suitors to press their cause. Both Brom Bones and Ichabod Crane knew the evening might prove decisive. And so, on a crisp autumn night, with the fields stripped bare and the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, the guests began to gather. Lanterns glowed from the windows of the Van Tassel home, wagons rattled along the lanes, and the sound of laughter floated through the hollow. Within those bright walls, fate awaited Ichabod Crane. The night of the Van Tassel harvest party was one of those evenings that seem made for festivity. The air was crisp with autumn chill, the sky dark but clear, and the valley glowed with lanterns set out to welcome the guests. Wagons rumbled up the lanes carrying farmers and their wives, while the younger folk came trotting on horseback, their laughter ringing against the still night. The Van Tassel farmhouse was broad and low, its windows shining with light, its doors flung open in cheerful welcome. Within, the rooms were bright with candles, the tables groaning under the weight of a feast. There were hams and turkeys, sausages and stews, pies of every fruit, cakes stacked high, and great bowls of cider steaming with spice. The scent of roasting meats and sweet pastry drifted out into the night, making mouths water long before anyone crossed the threshold. Ichabod Crane was among the first to arrive, astride Gunpowder, the bony plough horse he had borrowed for the occasion. Though the animal looked as though it might collapse under him, Ichabod himself was dressed with as much finery as he could muster. His only good suit was carefully brushed, his collar stiff, and his long frame perched awkwardly yet proudly in the saddle. He dismounted with exaggerated dignity, smoothed his coat, and strode into the farmhouse with the air of a man stepping into his destiny. His eyes, of course, were drawn first to the tables of food. He gazed upon them as a miser upon his treasure, his imagination filling with visions of endless feasting, of himself presiding daily over such abundance once Katrina was his. Every ham seemed already his property, every pie destined for his plate. His thin figure seemed to swell with satisfaction at the sight. But then he caught sight of Katrina herself, dressed in a gown of bright colors, ribbons in her hair, her eyes sparkling with mischief. She moved among her guests with easy grace, smiling here, laughing there, and Ichabod felt his heart leap. Tonight, he told himself, he would secure her favor. Tonight, he would triumph over Brom Bones. The dancing soon began, lively reels and jigs played by the fiddler. Ichabod, lanky though he was, proved surprisingly nimble on his feet. He pranced and twirled with exaggerated elegance, his long limbs swinging in rhythm, his face glowing with pride. When he led Katrina across the floor, he imagined the whole company admiring them, whispering that they were a perfect pair. Brom Bones was there too, leaning against the wall with folded arms, his expression dark. He could wrestle, he could race, he could leap higher and ride faster than any man in the valley, but he could not dance as lightly as Ichabod. He was forced to stand aside and watch, his jaw clenched, his pride wounded, while Ichabod strutted before him like a rooster in its primes. The music ended, the dancers fell back, and the guests gathered round the fire with mugs of cider. Conversation turned, as it so often did in Sleepy Hollow, to stories of the supernatural. One after another, the farmers and their wives told of strange sights and eerie sounds. They spoke of lights flickering in the swamp, of voices calling in the woods, of haunted spots where no man dared linger. But the story that always stirred the greatest shiver was that of the Headless Horseman. One farmer swore he had seen the rider dash past him on the road, the severed head held aloft in one hand, before vanishing at the church bridge. Another told of being pursued nearly half a mile, the phantom close at his heels, until he crossed into safety. The old wives nodded gravely, adding their own accounts of the ghostly trooper who could never rest, who searched eternally for what he had lost. Ichabod listened with wide eyes, his imagination aflame. He shuddered at every gruesome detail, yet he hung upon each word, unable to tear himself away. It was as though the tales both terrified and thrilled him, feeding that strange mixture of superstition and eagerness that defined his nature. Brom Bones, meanwhile, leaned forward with a sly grin. When it came his turn, he told his own tale, that he had once raced the horseman himself and nearly beaten him to the bridge. The company roared with laughter, though Ichabod paled, half believing the boast might be true. The stories wound on, the fire crackled low, and at last the guests began to rise, calling for their horses and wagons. One by one they departed, the farmhouse emptying, the night growing quiet. Ichabod lingered, his heart pounding with anticipation. The evening had gone well. He had danced with Katrina, listened raptly to her laughter, and shown himself a man of refinement. Surely now, with the guests departed, she would accept his suit. He found her in a quiet corner, and though no one ever knew what words passed between them, the result was plain. When Ichabod left the farmhouse a short while later, his face was pale, his lips pressed tight, his eyes filled with despair. Whatever Katrina had said, it had crushed his hopes. Perhaps she had been merely playing with him all along, delighting in his attention while her heart leaned toward Brom. Perhaps she had laughed at his presumption. Whatever the case, Ichabod Crane walked out into the night a defeated man, his dreams of fortune and comfort shattered in a single moment. He mounted Gunpowder, his head hanging, and rode away from the bright, warm lights of the Van Tassel farm into the dark and silent countryside. The merry music and laughter faded behind him. Ahead stretched only shadow, silence, and the long, haunted road. When Ichabod Crane rode away from the Van Tassel farmhouse that night, his heart was heavier than it had ever been. The music and laughter still floated faintly behind him, but to Ichabod they seemed like cruel echoes of his failure. Only an hour earlier, he had pictured himself triumphant. Katrina smiling at his words, perhaps even granting him her hand. Now the vision had shattered. Whatever she had said in their private conversation, it had left no doubt. She had dismissed his suit. His dreams of fortune, of presiding over Van Tassel's abundant estate, of feasting daily on hams and pies, of lording over fertile fields, all dissolved like mist. He saw himself once again as what he truly was, a poor schoolmaster with little more than a threadbare suit and a borrowed horse. Humiliation pressed on him as heavily as sorrow. How Brom Bones would laugh when he learned of Ichabod's failure. The thought was almost unbearable. Gunpowder, the bony plough horse he had borrowed, plodded along the road with weary steps, his long mane tangled in the breeze, his gait uneven and stubborn. Ichabod, lost in despair, scarcely noticed where they were heading until the darkness of the countryside gathered thickly around them. The moon had set, the night was black, and the woods closed in close to the path. The silence of the fields pressed upon him. The chirp of crickets and the occasional cry of a night bird were the only sounds. Yet to Ichabod's sharpened imagination, every rustle of leaves seemed a whisper from the unseen, every shadow a lurking figure. The stories told by the fire that very evening now weighed heavily on his mind. The Headless Horseman, they had said, haunted these very roads. He remembered too clearly the farmer who claimed to have been pursued, the man who swore he had seen the phantom vanish at the bridge. Ichabod tried to shake off the dread. He hummed a hymn, forcing the tune through his quavering voice, but the sound only deepened the silence that followed, and he soon fell quiet. He pressed his knees against Gunpowder's sides, urging him onward, but the horse seemed as reluctant as his rider. They passed the great tulip tree where Major Andre had been captured during the war. It loomed tall and black against the sky, its branches groaning in the wind. Many whispered that it was haunted, and Ichabod could not keep his eyes from it. He fancied he saw shapes moving among the branches, and he quickened Gunpowder's pace, his heart hammering. Beyond lay Wiley's Swamp, a place dreaded by all the villagers. The ground there was soft and treacherous, the air heavy with mist that clung to the earth like a ghostly veil. Gunpowder balked at the edge, snorting and tossing his head, but Ichabod forced him onward. The reeds rattled, the frogs croaked in the stagnant water, and now and then a splash echoed as though some unseen creature had slipped into the depths. Ichabod's imagination leapt at every sound. He fancied he heard footsteps behind him, only to turn and find nothing but shadows. At last they climbed a small rise beyond the swamp, and it was there that Ichabod saw it, a dark figure standing motionless by the roadside. At first he thought it a stump or a broken fence post, and he tried to laugh at his own fear. But then it shifted, and the faint outline of a horse and rider became clear. Ichabod's blood ran cold. He swallowed, summoned what courage he could, and called out, "Good evening, friend." His voice trembled in the night. The figure gave no answer. Gunpowder shied, stamping nervously. Ichabod tugged at the reins, edging forward. The mysterious rider moved too, setting his horse in step with Gunpowder. They proceeded side by side in silence, the stranger looming tall and still, never speaking, never falling behind. Ichabod's dread grew unbearable. He quickened his pace. The stranger quickened too. He slowed. The stranger slowed. At last, desperate, Ichabod turned his head fully to look upon his companion. And what he saw froze him to the marrow. The rider's shoulders were broad, his figure dark and imposing, but upon those shoulders there was no head. Instead, the head was carried before him, cradled in his arm like a dreadful trophy. A gasp escaped Ichabod's lips. His hands tightened on the reins, his heels pressed into Gunpowder's flanks. The horse leapt forward with sudden speed, and the dark rider spurred after him. The stillness of the night was broken by the thunder of hooves. The chase had begun. The moment Gunpowder leapt forward, Ichabod knew terror in its purest form. His long legs clutched desperately at the horse's sides, his thin body swaying with every bound. Behind him thundered the dreadful pursuer, the Headless Horseman, mounted on a massive steed that seemed to devour the ground with every stride. The road twisted through the woods, branches whipping against Ichabod's face, leaves scattering like frightened spirits. The night rang with the pounding of hooves, a terrible rhythm that matched the hammering of his own heart. He dared not look back, yet the sound of the phantom rider closing in was enough to drive him nearly mad with fear. Gunpowder, though bony and stubborn, now ran with all the desperation of a creature fleeing for its life. His eyes rolled white, his breath came in harsh snorts, and his ragged mane streamed in the wind. But for every frantic stride he took, the ghostly steed behind gained ground, swift and tireless, carrying its dreadful master nearer and nearer. Ichabod's thoughts flew wildly. He remembered every tale told by the fire, every warning whispered by the old Dutch wives. The horseman, they said, could not cross the church bridge. If only he could reach it. If only he could dash across those planks. Then perhaps the phantom would vanish, leaving him safe. That bridge, that one narrow crossing, became his only hope. He bent low over Gunpowder's neck, whispering, pleading, urging him on. "Faster, old boy, faster, for heaven's sake, faster." The horse responded with a fresh burst of speed, hooves striking sparks from the stones. The dark landscape rushed past in a blur, fields, fences, trees, all swallowed into the night. Still the horseman pursued. Ichabod could hear the great beast's breath behind him, hear the creak of saddle leather, and above all see, in flashes when he dared to glance aside, that awful figure, head cradled in its arm, cloak streaming like wings of darkness. They tore through the hollow, uphill and down slope, Ichabod shrieking prayers and curses alike. The road straightened, and in the distance he saw it, the pale outline of the church bridge arching over the stream. Salvation! His heart leapt. "The bridge! The bridge!" he cried, spurring Gunpowder with the last of his strength. The horse lunged forward, hooves drumming upon the planks. They thundered onto the bridge, Ichabod gasping with relief. He dared to turn, half expecting to see the phantom halt at the edge, unable to follow. But the horseman did not vanish. Instead, he rose high in his stirrups and with a terrible motion hurled the object he carried straight at Ichabod. It struck with a crash, a heavy, crushing blow to Ichabod's head. He tumbled from the saddle, sprawling into the dust. Gunpowder, freed of his burden, galloped wildly onward, leaving his rider behind. For a moment, silence returned to the night. The dark figure swept past, cloak flaring, then vanished into the shadows beyond the bridge. When the dust settled, nothing remained but the faint echo of hooves, the broken saddle, and the schoolmaster lying senseless on the ground. When Ichabod Crane did not appear at school the next day, the children waited at the door in puzzlement. The morning passed, the afternoon came, and still there was no sign of their master. At last, word spread through the village, and men set out to search the roads he had taken the night before. They found Gunpowder wandering near his stable, saddle broken and bridle gone. Following the tracks, they came to the old church bridge. There, in the dirt, lay Ichabod's hat. Close beside it was a shattered pumpkin, its orange flesh scattered on the ground. The trail ended there. No trace of the schoolmaster remained. The discovery caused a stir throughout Sleepy Hollow. The villagers gathered in hushed groups, trading theories in anxious whispers. Some shook their heads gravely and declared that the Headless Horseman had spirited Ichabod away, body and soul. The marks were plain, they said. The phantom had hurled its dreadful head and struck him down. Others were less certain. They pointed out the broken pumpkin and suggested with sly looks that perhaps Brom Bones knew more of the matter than he cared to admit. Brom himself laughed louder than anyone when the story was told. He listened with great amusement to the villagers' speculations, and whenever the tale of the pumpkin was mentioned, his broad shoulders shook with such hearty mirth that many concluded he had indeed played a trick on his rival. Yet he never confessed, and no proof was ever found. As for Katrina, not long after Ichabod's disappearance, she became the bride of Brom Bones. Their wedding was well attended, their house filled with merriment, and life at the Van Tassel farm continued in comfort and abundance. The memory of Ichabod faded. becoming little more than a story to be laughed over by the hearth. Some years later, travelers passing through another part of the country reported meeting a man who resembled Ichabod Crane. Taller and thinner even than they had expected, now working as a lawyer, perhaps even as a politician. These rumors suggested that Ichabod, humiliated by Katrina's rejection and frightened by Brom's trick, had fled the hollow in disgrace and built a new life elsewhere. Perhaps it was true. Yet in Sleepy Hollow, such practical explanations never hold as firmly as tales of the supernatural. For the legend of the Headless Horseman is too deeply rooted, too powerful in the minds of the people to be so easily dismissed. They prefer to believe that Ichabod was taken by the ghost, carried away into the night, never to be seen again. And every autumn, when the leaves fall and the nights grow long, the story is told once more of the schoolmaster who dared to court Katrina Van Tassel, and of the dreadful rider who brought his tale to its end. Even now, the people of the valley say the horseman still rides. On stormy nights, when the wind moans through the trees and the roads are dark and empty, they claim to hear the pounding of hooves echoing through the hollow. And if you stand by the old church bridge, very still, and listen closely, you may yet hear the gallop of the phantom steed, and see, just for an instant, the Headless Horseman searching endlessly for his lost head.